everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Laurel Page, and I am the Assistant Director of Events at the University of Colorado Boulder's Lead School of Business. Welcome to our 7th COVID-19 webinar series. These continue to be trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights for life during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the second of 6 webinars in this COVID-19 related webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to welcome Dr. Mark Hernandez here presenting Characterization and Control of Bioaerosols in the Built Environment in the Age of COVID. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Mark, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Mark will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now I am excited to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Mark Hernandez attained all of his degrees from University of California at Berkeley and is beginning his 25th year on the CU faculty. He is registered professional civil engineer and an expert on the characterization of bioaerosols, both indoors and outdoors. His research leverages forensic science and engineering for wide area surveillance and aerosol disinfectant systems for the built environment. Welcome, Mark, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand over the webinar controls to you now.
Okay, well, thank you for the invite. And I arrived here in 1995 in a snowstorm, just about this time after growing up in the Bay Area, and it was cold, and that was 25 years ago. Clearly things have changed. I wanted to share a picture, actually what I look like when the COVID pandemic isn't here. My barbershop is open, so still not open. And that's what I usually look like. Here I am today with markedly longer hair after a year of pandemic. And I'd like to share with you a story about what we're doing in schools to help with the kids and teachers' exposures. And the motivation here is unfortunately about COVID, although the story you're going to see equally applies to students and teachers' exposures to wildfire smoke, to influenza, to any other challenges that we have airborne in the indoor environment. So Pigpen is going to walk us through this story, and let's talk about what we've been doing in Denver public schools, at least, to help lower kids' exposures to airborne contaminants. The question I want to pose is, how do microbes accumulate indoors, given the large amount of time that kids spend kids and teachers spend in the classrooms? And the point of the matter, and especially with respect to the COVID, is all of us, kids as well, shed. We shed from our hair, our skin, we exhale our breath and so on. And we shed a lot. You'd be surprised how many we shed. We shed on the order of hundreds of thousands to millions of microbes for each of us every hour. So it's a fair amount. We deposit this stuff in through our activity indoor, occupant activity, especially with little kids. There's a lot of activity. We resuspend what we shed. So there's a fair amount of tiny microscopic particulate matter, of which a minority of which is COVID. We usually don't care about it. But when it can make us sick, we do. So there's this storm of microscopic stuff floating around. We generically refer to as dust. And I study as biological aerosol. So I'm going to use that term, bioaerosol. These are the little the little things that we can't see that we breathe every day and that kids breathe in schools. And they, in the absence of water damage, where we know we can get mold indoor, plants or pets, the major bioaerosol source are occupants. And depending on the architectural configuration, the ventilation conditions, if the doors and windows are open or not, this stuff can accumulate in response to occupant density on the orders of millions shed per person per hour. And if we were to go in to measure this every cubic foot or every cubic meter, we'd find startling numbers, tens to hundreds, if not millions of these little particles floating around, and their only way out is to be removed by the ventilation system. That's the major removal mechanism to get what we shed and what kids and teachers shed in the classroom out. And the more we bring in, and I'm sure, and I know we've heard this story from other professors here and other experts around, that the primary mechanism for this stuff not to accumulate is the ventilation system. It's the primary one. And you've heard the mantra, ventilate, open the windows, get fresh air through, which is possible, but obviously weather and building dependent. So that's where the challenge comes in. And Denver Public Schools invited me to characterize, in the age of COVID, their ventilation systems so they could take a prioritized approach to their buildings, because they have a lot of them. So Denver Public Schools has 207 operating schools, population approaching 100,000 students. There is no way we could characterize the ventilation in all those schools quickly in response to COVID. So we targeted to get a representative random sampling of at least 10% of their classrooms in the most common architectural configurations. Targeting the elementary schools, because the thought was it's going to be the little kids that come back first. And that is in fact what has happened. So we did a ventilation survey, and here's the first of several graphs I'm going to show you. Let me just walk you through this if you could follow my cursor. I'm going to just call this fresh air exchange. In classrooms randomly distributed throughout the, well, elementary school classrooms randomly distributed throughout the district. We also did middle and high, but we're going to talk about elementary schools today. These are the numbers of school on the left axis here, classrooms surveyed, and this is what building scientists call air exchange rate, and they're binned and they're numbered down here. And I'm going to explain how this works. It's not the most straightforward thing. So what this number says is the average amount of time it takes to replace the entire indoor volume with fresh outdoor air by ventilation and what we call infiltration. So all outdoor air sources moving through, removing those airborne particles that we introduce with Pigpen and taking them to the outside, assuming the outdoor air doesn't have this background bioaerosol that we care about it. So the way that you can interpret these numbers, they're actually reported in inverse hours. Yeah. So if you look at this first bar here, it takes 1 hour to replace all, or the one volume is replaced in an hour. Here, this says 2 volumes. And the way you can interpret this is, okay, if it takes an hour to remove the volume, or we do 2 volumes per hour or 3 volumes per hour, you can actually translate this to minutes. Okay. So this first column, it takes 60 minutes to remove all the air on average in an air exchange with fresh air from the outside. Another set of classrooms, 10 of them or 11 of them, it only took 30 minutes. A majority of them took 20 minutes and so on. So these translate back to 3 air changes per hour, 4 air changes per hour, and you can relate that to how much time it replaces. And the further you are to the right side of the graph, the better off you are, the more fresh air you see during the day as an occupant. So that's what these mean. We want to see more stuff on the right side of the graph, less stuff on the left side of the graph. And there are industry guidelines for this. And unfortunately, some of the schools, too many of the schools are below those industry guidelines. And the recommendation in the age of COVID, this was an author out of the Indoor Environment Group at Syracuse, very active, thoughtful group. And they were suggesting after survey, ventilated classrooms in the US, at least the mechanically ventilated ones, the ones that had purposeful ventilation systems, not just relying on windows, 20% of their supply came from outdoors. 80% was recycled. So the recommendations are to change to as much outdoor air as possible. And if they have the operational capacity, that is, if the fans and the system, that everything that runs the ventilation system actually had the design ability to double that ventilation rate, if at all possible, weather allowing and so on. So in response to that, the fact of the matter is a lot of the Denver schools could not meet this because of their age. A lot of the schools are aged, and although they could be retrofit, many of them were designed mostly for thermal comfort and not through high throughput ventilation. I include a couple of the buildings that were typical of many in Denver. The Valverde School, you can see the erection date was 1923. Beautiful Art Deco buildings. They have these gorgeous legacy buildings for many of their schools in Denver, but they weren't designed for this kind of high throughput ventilation. And as a matter of fact, many of them have radiant heat and inoperable windows, excuse me. So there's limitations because of the architecture, the age of the school, how they manage their thermal comfort systems. Here's some more radiators and these univent things that are right up against windows that don't open. And these can only bring a certain amount of outdoor air in to meet recommendations or to lower exposures based on architectural and ventilation factors are tough to do in a fair amount of buildings in Denver School District. So what we did was prioritize engineering controls in those classrooms that couldn't really get a lot of fresh air exchange in them because they weren't designed to do so, couldn't be rapidly architecturally retrofit. And what we focused on are the schools with the largest air, or we prioritized the schools with the largest air exchange rates, the most amount of time to get fresh air in. And we did not focus on, at least not yet, the schools that had very fast air exchange rates. And just to give you an idea here, these schools in the green and blue up here on this end, those are the design recommendations for CDC for medical settings, for medical and dental, not dental, but medical clinics. When you go see a doctor, there's a purposeful high air exchange rate in there for the purpose of reducing exposure to airborne and infectious disease. So what we wanted to do was not focus on those, but focus on the schools that needed the most help the quickest. And the way that we did that was look at in-room filtration, tried and true technology, been around since NASA. There's a special name for them that I'll introduce and you may have heard of already, but those classrooms that didn't have high air exchange, high fresh air availability because of architectural factors, we actually put these filters in their room, and they have two effects. They help mix the room air to dilute what bioaerosol there is into the entire volume, thereby enabling what ventilation was there to do its job better. But also these in the room near the students where they're placed efficiently remove these very tiny particles. These types of filters, it's kind of a mouthful. They're called high efficiency particulate air filters, or HEPA, HEPA. I'm going to use that abbreviation through the rest of the presentation. So if you can't get enough throughput, you're maximizing your ventilation system. An engineering control that's available and affordable is to put these HEPA filters actually in the students, strategically placed during the class to help remove the particles that are there. So we did this in a random smattering of elementary schools. The first shot at it was we picked 5 schools, 30 classrooms in total. This was during the summer before the kids were going to come back. And we measured the bioaerosol concentration. This is a special instrument. It's a research instrument that we bring in, and it can in real time tell us the total particle load of what can get in your lungs, this abbreviation PM, and the fraction thereof that's probably of a biological origin, virus, bacteria, fungi, pollen. And we bin them. And if you look at these numbers on the side here, first of all, in this parentheses, this is the size range of these particles. They're all microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye. They're floating around, teeny tiny. That's the micro designation here. They're on the size range of airborne bacteria that we all shed. And you can see, look at the numbers on the axis here. These are big numbers, 800,000 per cubic meter. All right, millions per cubic meter or cubic yard if you're stuck in US units. So there's a lot there. And look at the diversity across the schools. Yeah, some schools had very high load, some schools had relatively low load, some were in between. So we have this distribution of not only ventilation rates, but airborne particle loads in the schools when the kids weren't there. Okay, this is background stuff. So there's a legacy load of dust and other things in there, including biology, before COVID ever shows up. So what we did then was go in and purposely disturb the classrooms as the kids would. We input some energy when they came, and you can see that's the red bars here. We got a bump just from resuspension. Yeah. And what we wanted to see is, hey, can these HEPA filters take a bite out of this? Is it significant in less than an air exchange rate in just a few minutes of their operation? So we turned on these filters with the ventilation systems running as they would be with the kids in there. And that's what the gold bars show here, that we could get a significant effect, that the higher load, the higher the difference, and that it did so in a very short period of time. And this is important when the background ventilation system is running. It's going to be more effective where you have higher particles and less ventilation than when you have lower particle loads, because there is ventilation. And that gives you a strategy for targeting how many of these HEPA filters do you put in? What schools get them first? Because some schools had relatively low particle loads anyway. And part of the reason being they had their ventilation systems were higher than those. In this particular case, school 3 had radiant heat and non-operable windows and had a background ventilation system that couldn't be rapidly updated. So that's how we prioritized and validated the use of these HEPA filters and got a gauge for, hey, how fast can we get a handle on how well these are working in the different sites? So the take-home message is, with the kids in the classroom, these HEPA filters have two effects. One is they dilute those particles. They have fans in them that dilute particles in the entire volume of the space. Those volumes are markedly different per school, even for the same number of students. And two, near the students, it efficiently removes particles in the room where they shed them. So that's the strategy. And the paradigm is, let's dilute these particles, let's remove them both with filtration and ventilation, and verify that effectiveness. And verifying that effectiveness is the story I'm going to tell you now. Here are a couple of our field technicians. These are engineering students. And what they're doing is they're deploying, and you can see this big white, not big white, but modest sized white tower in the middle. That's a HEPA filter that they're hooking up in a classroom. I can't remember what school this was, but it was an older school. You can see the cinder block in back of them. And they're plugging it in and putting the monitors in the classroom to actually verify in real time what's going on when the kids come back. So they're setting up for this. And we had student teams of 2. We had 3 student teams of 2 going out to the different schools and doing this. And this is the first of a certain type of data I'm going to show you. This is real-time, what we call PM monitoring, particulate matter, airborne particulate matter monitoring in 2 size ranges. These size ranges are what the EPA uses to judge outdoor air pollution, and we brought those same metrics inside. This smaller range, this 2.5, is the stuff that can actually penetrate deep into your lung. The 10 usually gets caught in your facial structure, maxillofacial structure, and that's removed in your ear, nose, and throat, your mouth, and so on. Nonetheless, it's important because COVID can live in that size fraction too. So that's what we're looking at in gross numbers per meter cubed. I'm going to blow up this axis for you in a minute, but for now, let's inspect all these little abbreviations down here. The numbers are classroom numbers. The abbreviations are for the different schools. And these are real-time numbers of airborne biological particles in these microscopic size ranges and non-biological particles, dirt, diesel soot, stuff that comes from outside, the stuff that's non-living, that's the gray bar. And you can see one thing pops out right away. We've got some outliers. And this real-time ability to look at the airborne particle load in the classrooms as the kids were there or before they arrived gave us some guidance on which schools and which classrooms we need to focus on first and get those filters in a prioritized manner, because they clearly had higher biological particle loads, total loads, or both fractions of biology and not. The other thing that you can see is there are averages and standard deviations to this. So we can apply statistics to help us get some normalized performance threshold for classrooms that really need it and classrooms that will get some incremental benefit from classrooms that absolutely would need a HEPA filter right away. Because the fact of the matter is the resources weren't available to outfit all schools all the time. And as a matter of fact, some schools actually didn't need it. The ventilation was so good that they were at medical clinic standards already. So adding those to schools with very low averages is not a good use of resources. They really wouldn't realize a big benefit. The effectiveness of the filters wouldn't really come out to anything. So here's a blow up. So we're gonna look at just one of these schools here, the one actually on the end here. This is Cheltenham Elementary in West Colfax area. It's an old school built in the 1920s, I believe is the original building. So there's this old wing here that you see on the left, and then this new wing on the right. And each one of these classrooms you can see is segregated into PM 2.5 and PM 10. Now you have a blow up of this axis, numbers of particles times 1,000. So we're looking at 400, 300, 200,000, lots of particles in a cubic meter of air. The green is the biologically associated stuff, bacteria, fungi, their spores, and so on, possibly viruses. And the gray is non-biological particles, all the non-living stuff that's floating around. The take-home message here is, and it really pops out, is the old wing has a much higher bioaerosol load and total particle load than does the new wing, although the air exchange rates in many instances are comparable. This has to do with building materials, the type of ventilation system. The old wing had radiant heat. The new wing had a centralized HVAC system, heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. The old wing didn't have any air conditioning, or recently only had it put in. So even within the same school, you could see big differences in particle exposures. So this information told us, hey, right away, we're going to prioritize this old wing and look at the effects and performance of HEPA filters there. So let's look at, after we characterize these schools, we put in every one of these classrooms carbon dioxide monitors and particle monitors that were there 24/7. So this is an example at Cheltenham in both their new and old classrooms of carbon dioxide traces since the new year. And we can watch this daily and you can see how they go up. If you could follow my tracer, this is when the kids come in the classroom. This number, this CO2, is a proxy for ventilation performance. So having the gases and the particles are important. You can see the carbon dioxide loads in the older classroom shown here in the purple is different than the newer classroom shown in the yellow. And that difference is manifest in this data that I showed you, in that the ventilation is removing those particles in a much more efficient manner in the new wing than it did in the original school, although second graders are in the old wing and the new wing, and so on. All things considered equal, what we're trying to do is get some equity across the district by measuring this in real time, deploying these filters in a resourced and evidence-based manner where they need to be in the most needy situations. So that's how we're using this. So we have this ventilation proxy, that's CO2. And then we have also PM monitors that measure this fine particulate matter since we deployed these filters. And you can see this trace as well. This is PM1. This is the very fine stuff, could carry virus, could carry it deep into your lungs. Also at this same school, and you notice a trend pop out. See the purple lines here? So we can see when a HEPA filter has been disengaged or is in malfunctioning. Either the kids turn it off, something's gone wrong with those HEPA filters, But more importantly is you can see the effect of them not operating. The airborne particle loads go up an order of magnitude from 2 to 20 in that size fraction. So this really highlights the importance and the efficacy and how well these things can work or not work when they're out there. So we have set the Denver School District up with this real-time monitoring that their facilities people can watch for this type of behavior. So the engineering endpoint is they matter, especially when ventilation is poor. The translation to practice and practical endpoint is that the facilities people can see this and correct it in real time. So that's one side of the research in my laboratory that's translated to practice for the benefit of our community in the time of COVID. The other is, what about cleaning? We spent a lot of money, energy, and attention on cleaning, and cleaning supplies and how we clean it. And there's been some argument in the public health community of, hey, it's all airborne. We were wrong. We shouldn't have paid attention to surfaces. We don't need to clean as much as we've been hyper cleaning. And this next series of slides speak to that. So what about what we deposit? And kids deposit a lot of things on desks, among other, their finger oil, saliva, all those types of things. And what about cleaning in the age of COVID? Okay. And what this is about is, before cleaning occurred, we're going to take a look at this. And the scientific name for things that were airborne, have become on surfaces and could translate a disease-causing vector, is called a fomite. So I'm just going to call it that from now on. And what we did was look at public school desks for the presence of these different viruses: adeno, noro, influenza, and coronavirus. We've probably heard of all the others except for corona. Now, we were researching this before the pandemic hit. So what I'll show you is what we found on school top desks in the pre-COVID era. And here's the sampling scheme. We started early in the flu season. We sampled desks, and on those desks, we used swabs, and we harvested the DNA and RNA that was there. We sequenced that and looked for genetic sequences associated with these viruses throughout the flu, what we call generically the flu season. But we looked for these other respiratory and enteric viruses as well. And here's the first of these survey results. This is now, we're looking at virus gene copies on this axis on a log scale. 6 is 1,000,000, 4 is 10,000, and so on. And here are the different viruses, noro being the non-respiratory virus, corona, rhino, and adeno being respiratory. Interestingly, we found millions of copies of these out there. Corona being less than adeno and rhinovirus, common cold virus, but we didn't find any flu in the middle of flu season, which is one of the limitations of these genetic surveys, right? We have to know what we're looking for. The primers have to be correct. So we don't always know what's out there, and we don't always have the right genetic primers or ability to find this year's flu or so on. And although we found cases of flu in the schools, we couldn't find any virus on the desktops. One is it may have been airborne and not present, or it was an analytical limitation. But we did find our friend coronavirus out there. And here's the setup. In elementary schools, kids sit at the same desk all day, every day, by and large. They don't move around. And if you look at the desktop that we randomly sampled for, we're largely looking in a K-6 environment in public schools at an individual signal, something that we pick up from an individual student at an individual desk. And if you look at that probability, here's what we found in 24 desk classrooms after sampling hundreds and hundreds of desks over what was ostensibly the flu season. And basically, if you do the probability on it, we got about a 1 in 5 hit rate. That is, about 20% of the desks had any sign of these respiratory viruses, something like that, 1 in 5 desks. If we do that same analysis in middle and high school settings where the students go from room to room and often change desks in different classrooms, what we call hoteling, and do that same approach, we now see a community, more towards a community virus signal, because there are multiple inhabitants of a desk over the course of a day. And we sampled these desks in the afternoon after the kids have left. So there's a cumulative probability perspective here. And when you do that, the probability of getting a desktop that has one or any of these is now moved from 1 to 5 to 2 to 3. You have a 60% chance of sitting somewhere with the genetic signal or genetic association with one of these. So that's an important aspect of how we school. So maybe the idea is we move the teachers to the classrooms and the kids stay put rather than the kids migrate. So that's a suggestion for a change in educational practice based on occurrence of virus. And what it says also, if we're just looking at corona, if the half-life is about 8 hours on plastic, the covering on desks, then in a day, we're looking at about a log reduction. 1 in 10 would be present. In 2 days, we're looking at a couple of log reductions and so on. And it does depend on the original dose there, the exposure. So this cumulative probability becomes important in our current exposure assessment with respect to K through 12 in high school. And then that brings into, should we clean with the enhanced frequency that we have been? My opinion is we should continue our enhanced cleaning protocols. I don't think that it certainly can't hurt. And this feeds into still the unsolved argument. Yes, it's airborne. Yes, it's on surfaces. How significant is one with respect to another? So in summary, and I'm just coming up on a half an hour here, social distancing is important. We can supplement classrooms, and we should target classrooms that have lower performing ventilation or architectural characteristics such that the room air is not well mixed in our schools with HEPA filtration. Obviously, masks are an encouragement still. And this idea of proximity, time, and concentration really matter and feed back into what's the appropriate occupancy in our classroom, given our cleaning practice, given our ventilation practice, or what ventilation is available to us. Obviously very different in the summer and winter in the seasons. If we can have doors open and closed, windows open and closed, that changes this operational paradigm, and that verifying the effectiveness of these engineering controls in real time is important. So with that, I want to introduce, in closing, my team. Not my team, our team. These guys were awesome. All of them are our current students or recent graduates in architecture or engineering. Dr. Odessa Gomez, one of our PhD graduates from 5 years ago, came back to lead this project. I have an awesome project manager, Anna Seeger. Most of the team is bilingual, so they could actually confer with many of the custodial staff in the evenings when we were in the schools in both Spanish and English. And we had significant philanthropic support from Carrier, Intel, and Detection Tech here in Boulder. Joni Ricks is the facilities manager for the DPS, and she was the one that got us access. Unbelievable university agency cooperation like I've never experienced before, to get this done and get this in the schools before the kids came back this spring. So that's the game. At this point, I want to open it up for questions. We're just about 35 minutes in, and I turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Mark. Our first question is, what are the recommended ventilation standards for large venues like a children's museum?
I mean, right now there's a lot of arguments over this, and different venues, obviously based on, and I'll bring that slide back up, occupancy and occupancy patterns should have different ventilation requirements. So there's a lot of argument in the community of what's the difference between a standard, a guideline, right? A legislative, something that's actually statute like the EPA outdoor air quality standards, for these very different environments. CDC's recommendations, ASHRAE, which is the American Society for Heating, Ventilation, and Air Conditioning, for refrigeration engineers. So right now it's all over the board, and you're saying a select environment like a museum, right? This is a walk-through venue. I don't know. And right now, what I think we need to do is be conservative with these standards to the degree that the buildings can actually perform at that level. So if we have a standard, it has to actually be something we can implement, that we can do. And if we can't, we have to have these other engineering controls in place, like the HEPA filters that I showed you. So I wish I had a hard answer for you. I don't. What I can tell you is there's controversy, and we have to be conservative with these. If not, we do the best we can in winter and summer. And if the best we can isn't a reasonable ventilation standard, if we're obviously too low, 2 or 1 air changes per hour, we got to do something with the social distancing, which we are. And I say, we, meaning the public health officials who suggest this to the school districts and so on, and filtration. So there is no one good answer right now.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from John. Can the concentration of CO2 be a proxy for the freshness of the air in a room?
Yeah, so you're using 2 words here, John, proxy and freshness. And these mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, in the most conservative sense, fresh means it's not got a lot of exhaled gases, from people, and it doesn't have a lot of particles in it. So it's an indicator of, if it's used right, ventilation performance. Okay. So the lower, obviously the better, but there's a lot of architectural assumptions that go behind that, which is why I'm an advocate of verifying this in practice. So there are a lot, and they're disseminated on social media. You'll see them all over the place on the internet, of modeling efforts and suggestions that one size fits all, CO2 needs to be below this level. But that has a lot of caveats. That means the room air has to be well mixed, which in the hundreds and now actual thousands of classrooms that I've seen and inspected, this was well before COVID, that's not a good assumption. I think more rooms are not well mixed than they're supposed to be. And that's when the idea of a single value for CO2 falls apart, of using that as the proxy or the indicator for performance. And, just in Denver alone, ceiling height is all over the place, right? Some rooms have 8-foot ceilings, some have 20. And getting that room air well mixed and sampling that CO2 number appropriately, such that each student is breathing, approximately the same level of CO2, is an important part of this, ensuring good mixing and so on. So with CO2, one size doesn't fit all. We have to pay attention to it. And the way that we pay attention to it is installing these real-time monitors that help us do that. And that they have to be strategically placed. We can't just put them on one student and say, that's representative of everybody. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Sam. Do you recommend a computational fluid dynamics software for modeling contaminant generation / capture?
Absolutely. That's a pretty high-end thing. That involves computers, that it involves expertise, it involves relatively expensive software. I'm an engineer. I demonstrate the translation of technology to practice. CFD, computational fluid dynamics, would be one of them. Do I see that writ large being implemented on hundreds of classrooms across the district? No, I don't. Would I love to see that happen? Absolutely. But right now we don't have the time or resources to do that with every classroom. And indeed, every classroom is different. And what we did was pick the most, the most common classroom configurations. So when we chose classrooms, we did so like, this is the most common one with ventilation here, supply ventilation here, return ventilation here, windows on such side, heat gain, and all the architectural factors that we could group, we did. And that would have to be the approach with CFD. I don't see that being used writ large, and it's a very high skill set to use it, right? It is translating to practice, but it's got a fair amount of cost with it and so on. If we could do it, great. If we can't wait for it.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Donna. Should windows be opened or closed while the HEPA filter is running?
Great question. Again, very site specific, could be even classroom specific within a school. So here's something I want to, let me see if I can give you a little picture. Okay, so ventilation systems are often designed for a conservative condition. That is the height of summer or the cooling mode, and the height of winter, the heating mode. And when we're in cooling and heating, which we are a lot here in Colorado, particularly heating mode, the ventilation system operates a certain way, and it's designed with windows closed, right? So depending on how the school is operating that ventilation system and how it was designed, if the pressure inside is generically lower than that outside, opening the windows is great. It brings in fresh air, right? If it's pressure neutral or slightly positive, opening the windows does nothing, right? To bring in fresh air, just the act of opening them. HEPA filters, to get to your question, respond to the local particle load, yeah, and the ventilation system. If the ventilation system is really good and it's operating well, HEPA filters don't really have a big role in it. It's the ventilation system that governs. The same would be true with windows. If you open the windows with the HEPA filters there, and the windows really have a significant addition, the school's under negative pressure, and fresh air comes in, it rushes in, HEPA filters won't have that much of a bite. Their effectiveness drops. They're supplementary with respect to the ventilation. They are not the primary control. So it's very contextual. The numbers matter. The air exchange rate matters. If the HEPA filter is going to be very effective and have a big contribution to lowering exposure, or a lesser contribution. And windows can play a role in that depending on the context.
What is the theoretical service life of these HEPA filters in schools before the need to replace them?
Years. Especially, there's a new generation of them. It's like anything else, right? And any technology, right? Computers are getting faster, better, cheaper, and lasting longer. Same with electric cars, all these things. And HEPA filter technology, you know, it was born in the NASA era, space race stuff. And essentially, it's a fan and a filter. That's really what it is. But this new generation of them, and I'm going to put that picture back up. This one right here, that's between Brady and Christian, represents this new generation that's actually very important for a couple reasons in the school environment. First of all, this is radial intake, so it comes in from 360 degrees, all directions essentially. It discharges through the top, clean fresh air at a relatively high velocity, such that it induces mixing in the space of particle-free air. So that's design point number 2. Design point number 3 is it's quiet. And the cheaper ones are not necessarily quiet. They only come in from one side. I've seen them deployed where the intake side is faced against a wall. You can't do that with radial intake, or that, you know, one side is intake and one side is discharge. It's actually not vertical. So if it's horizontal intake and horizontal discharge, that's not the best design. So this new generation are quiet, vertical discharge, radial intake, and they have a high flow rate for a given acoustic envelope. And that's really important to the teachers, that they can have high throughput without making a lot of noise. So, because the teachers have to talk over these things, and all the acoustics in a classroom add up. So these will last years, and we're going to investigate the actual, how often do we have to replace the filters? We're hoping for, in most situations, like not in a construction zone or near a highway where you get other particles in, these can last an academic year. The replacement filters are looking about $30 on these models, because they're really simple. They're easy in and out. The custodians can do it with little training and so on. So looking at multiple years, I'm anticipating 3. I've had one in my house for 20 years. I just replaced the filter, and I replace the filter probably once every 9 months, maybe academic year. So that's the order that we're talking about here. And this next gen, I'm really hopeful for them. The core technology is really simple: filter and a fan. So it's all the design around it that matters.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to move into our final 2 questions. From Alexander, why are some schools better at filtering out biological particles while others seem to not filter any out at all?
Great question. This goes back to some of the slides that I showed you earlier, and this cleaning idea. Let me go back to cleaning here. I hate paging through slides. It makes me sick when I watch the screen. Anyway, this idea of cleaning, yeah, the occupants shed, but the actual structure has a microbiome too. So depending on its age, depending on if it was flood damaged, depending on its architectural textiles, carpet, tile, all those aspects host a different microbiome. And I spent years researching this. Actually, we had a community based at the University of Colorado that had been called the Microbiology of the Built Environment to answer exactly that question. And it turns out to be all these issues that are unique to building: materials, occupant history, age, type of heating ventilation system. Are there rugs or not? Oh, and you can probably see how this starts to add up. So that's why we see different indoor microbial fingerprints in some buildings than others, as well as their numbers. So it's identity, distribution, and abundance before anybody gets in the building for the school year is markedly different across buildings. What is not different is how much these occupants shed and the human microbiome that goes in the air. Most recently, we're concerned about what small percentage of that is actually COVID, right? And finding COVID in this is like a needle in a haystack. So what we got to do is knock down the whole thing. Yeah, we got to remove that entire storm with our HEPA filters and cleaning. So that's why they're different between buildings. We know that now from many, many genetic surveys of buildings. As an engineer, what is important to me is just removing that biological storm, particularly in this pandemic time. But that same approach with HEPA filters and cleaning can apply to wildfires, influenza, the next pandemic, and so on. So I believe it's a worthwhile investment.
Thank you, Mark. Our final question comes from Bob. Was there or will there be any consideration of UVC upper level disinfectant or needlepoint ionization?
There is and has been, and very different than HEPA filtration. If you can understand, these filters actually go in the room, right, where the kids are. UVC can go in the room in some contexts. Needlepoint actually goes in the duct. So if you can picture UVC that are either in duct or needlepoint that's actually, needlepoint's not in the room, it's in duct, that's a different strategy, right? The filters are down there with the kids. If it's not mixed, it's the highest concentration. If it's well mixed, it's the most strategic place to do it. So there's in room and between rooms. Needlepoint and UVC tend to be the stuff, so that stuff on COVID from one room, if it does make it to the other room, these are disinfecting approaches. The jury is still very out on the effectiveness of needlepoint. UVC's been around for years. Great technology, not always the best for in-room in schools, especially where there's low ceilings or architectural factors that inhibit UVC, because this is basically a UV light above your head. You don't want that on your skin or eyes. And UV is great in ducts too. It's great for disinfecting stuff. It doesn't remove particles though. So it's part of a different approach and a different strategy. I'm going to wait to advocate about needlepoint ionization as an effective strategy. We just don't have enough data on that in the field, or yeah, actually not in the field. UV's been around for a long time, well engineered, lots of vendors, great in duct between rooms, a little bit limited for schools in room for disinfecting COVID, and different cost basis. Yeah, got to replace the lights. They have operating temperature range differences and so on. I think that's much more appropriate for healthcare settings, but doesn't mean it can't work in some school settings.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much for everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And again, thank you to Mark for his great information. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU Boulder alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is February 10th, as Deborah Jason presents on creating a dynamic LinkedIn profile that encourages engagement in the midst of COVID-19. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs.